Welcome to Carrying Wayward, a supernatural podcast for fans who aren't ready to let go and newcomers to the series who are ready to jump in. I'm Marie Vigourou.
And I'm Drew Schulman. In this episode, we're diving into Supernatural Season 8, Episode 11, LARP and the Real Girl. Let's get this show on the road.
So what did we think, Drew?
This was amazing. Again, this is one of those ones we watched live with our listeners. So if you were there, thank you for being there. And thank you for choosing this as a live episode. It was so good.
It was honestly so much fun to watch this. There's some stuff about that live watch that I'm going to share a little bit later on in the episode because I'm going to come back to that.
Ooh.
You loved it. We all loved it. It was fun.
This week, Patreon and Coffee supporters got to hear us answer the question, what's the coolest experience you've had at a Ren Fair or con? On the supporter-exclusive Impala Talk feed. You can go to carryingwayward.com to support us and claim your perks.
I can already feel that the energy is a little bit unhinged, a little bit chaotic, and we haven't even answered the question yet, so that's going to be fun. I don't know if it's the solar storm that we're experiencing right now, because we are recording this on an evening where there is a solar storm happening, but we are definitely a little bit unhinged, or a little bit more unhinged than usual.
I feel that.
Are we ready for the recap?
Count me down.
3, 2, 1, texting and murder.
We have a murder of a poor guy in his super nerdy home, which of course listeners at the live show looked at my background and went, oh yeah, your room. Weird symbol on arm. We start doing some research. It turns out that this guy is friends with a dude from a Ren Fair. They look up the Ren Fair, and of course, who is like the queen of nerds at this event? But Charlie's back. They go to the Ren Fair. They partner with Charlie. They find out they don't know what it is yet. They do some research. Eventually, we figure out it's a fairy who's been kidnapped by some dude who has a crush on Charlie and wants to use real dark fairy magic to stop everyone to get in her good books, which is super weird because not her type, clearly. But fairy is freed and smooch time.
This episode was written by Robbie Thompson, directed by Jeanne Mossoir. It originally aired on January 23rd, 2013.
What a fun episode, but doing the recap, it's very much like, oh yeah, we get a lot of good Charlie development. We get kind of like a few fun moments here and there, but really the story is incredibly simple.
That's what makes the charm of it, right? Like, not every story needs to be like packed with plot, especially not in like 23 episode seasons, right? Otherwise, like, we would just not be able to contain the amount of plot that we would be given.
Yeah, like this very much feels like on paper could be a skipped episode, but if anyone tells me they skipped this episode, I might hit them.
I do have in my notes that it is a standalone or like self-contained episode. So you can watch it pretty much any time, but I definitely don't consider that one a skip.
If you were to remove it from this season, I don't think it would affect the overall season.
Oh, no.
Except for your own enjoyment and love.
Really, at the end of the day, it is those episodes that actually make the soul, the heart and soul, the heart and soul of a show. And the fact that now we have like 6 episode seasons, like, it means that we don't really have a lot of time to develop the heart and soul of any season.
I just listened to a great podcast actually about that and talking about how like this change in length of seasons has affected some of that a little bit. It reminds me when I go back to these shows, like, well, for the first time Supernatural, but other shows in the past, that it's like when you have the time to flush things out and just give us, here's a day in the life, it adds so much.
So much. All right, so before we begin with the long game of this episode, I really need to highlight the fact that I forgot something last week. And it wasn't the road so far for this episode. And when I saw it, I screamed because I was like, I cannot believe that I forgot to talk about this. When Dean breaks up with Benny last episode, he tells him adios. And believe it or not, at some point, this will pay off. Rochelle, this is when you should be playing Mastermind by Taylor Swift, yeah, in the background?
There's times you drop things like this, and like, will I remember when this pays off? I'm assuming you will let me know, and we've done it in the past. You'll be like, remember that thing from like 8 seasons ago?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I'm looking forward to that.
We do get Charlie back this episode, so thanks again, Robbie Thompson, for both creating her and bringing her back to us.
Yeah, seriously, Robbie, you're earning so many points in my books just by letting her exist in this universe.
So like I said, this is a pretty like standalone or self-contained episode. Like we don't really have that much to talk about in the long game because like believe it or not, we're not going to be seeing any of these people again except for Charlie.
More Charlie, please.
We do get a Garth phone call, which I really love as a way to like keep the brothers connected to their hunter community, right? Like without having to, increase budget to like see or to hear DJ Qualls, right? Like it's just saying like, "Hey Garth, you're on the line," kind of thing. Very smart. Lovely.
It's so small, but it does so much for building everything. And I do kind of love keeping, like, I feel like given the status he kind of revealed that he has within the community as almost like a pseudo Bobby, like, next of kin, it feels nice that he kind of has, like, one, that he's still involved, but I also love that he's, like, secretly tracking them and sending them jobs. Like, a real Charlie from Charlie's Angels. I love it.
To be fair, he's not tracking them, he's Garthing them. Which sounds so much worse.
Oh my god.
Sam and Dean do get completely exposed by Boltar, who can immediately see that their FBI badges are fake. And I just really love that it took like an interactive literaturist to notice that the badges were fake and that all the cops that they've met before have not noticed that.
I feel like a lesser show would have been like insulted them more for making those mistakes, but he's like legitimately impressed by how good the other parts of it are, which I really thought was nice.
It's like, no, these are really good, but they're fake. Like, I can tell. Charlie says that the one thing that she cares about is not getting her other arm broken or dying.
I would really hope that neither of those happen to her, one more so than the other, but
I certainly hope none of those happen to her.
One you can recover from, but in this show, both are pretty much not permanent issues.
Maybe one or two of these things will happen one or two more times.
I hate that you're doing this to me.
What if I told you I'm a mastermind? It was all by design.
I hate the idea of the show doing this to me. They did it with Bobby. They're going to keep bloody doing it. I am already counting down the days until they take Benny from me permanently, so why not? Why shouldn't Charlie be at risk?
In her tent, Charlie has a painted portrait of herself as queen, and it is so reminiscent of Crowley having portraits of himself in hell. And I love that for both of them equally, frankly.
I would just love if this becomes like a blanket, like shorthand for like faux royalty in any scenario we get it. Like as soon as you see a character have a giant portrait of themselves, you're like, they think they're royalty and they're not.
This week, our theme is escapism. Interestingly, escapism is actually a fairly new word. It appeared in American English in 1933. It does come from the word escape, though, which has such a cool and thematic etymology for this particular episode. The word escape comes from a Latin word that was used to describe the action of removing one's cape if your battle opponent had a hold of it. So, like, literally, imagine like some Roman dudes fighting one another, and then one catches the other's cape. And then the dude whose cape just got caught takes off his cape and then goes, "Aha, escape."
I'm sure it's exactly what they would say.
I hope so, because that's how I'm picturing it now. It's canon in my mind. So obviously I love the fact that like there are literal capes in this episode. And Drew, you're actually the one who picked this theme, and I hadn't looked up the etymology beforehand. So yeah, just like a little lovely serendipitous moment here. And I think that in the context of this episode, I sort of just want us to remember that escape can be literally life-saving and that escapism can be a helpful tool.
Escape.
Do you know that actually it comes from that Latin word, right? But then after that, it's an old French word that is pronounced escape.
Oh, that would make sense actually for a French pronunciation of that variant, yeah.
And so when Dory says escape, she's actually saying like the French original.
She's not being silly, she's just speaking French.
She's just being very, very etymologically conscious.
I'm also super annoyed because I can picture a fight scene in a film where that literally happens, where someone gets caught by the cape and like very daftly like unclasps it and like surprises the person who's fighting them.
It had to be a thing because there's a word to describe the action. You know what I mean? Like, I never thought about this as being a thing because it's never really depicted all that much in media. But like it had to be a thing because we still use the word to describe the thing. I don't know. I just think it's crazy.
I love that. But one, it's bugging me that I can picture the fight scene and like the swinging around a castle on a chandelier and the exact scene, but I can't tell you what movie it is.
Listeners, please tell us if you know which movie Drew is talking about.
Or any other examples. I'm sure there's tons of them. I feel like Princess Bride might do it at some point.
And if so, they're being incredibly historically accurate because that was a thing, apparently.
Because that movie is incredibly historically accurate.
I mean, listen, some elements can be realistic.
Let's start with Sam this week, because Sam gets the short end of the stick here. Like, really, this week is the Charlie and Dean show. He does sort of get, like, to act as an audience surrogate when watching Dean interact with the world of LARP, and, like, the same way we get to see him do it, which I think adds, like, a nice layer to the design of the episode.
They gave Sam an actual storyline last week, so they couldn't really do that twice in a row. Like, that would just be too much for Sam, unfortunately, for the writers. You know, all jokes aside, I do agree that Sam does get a bit sidelined, although he does get his own little, like, thingy thing later with Galandria, right?
Sam seems so wrapped up in the job that he doesn't really appear to let himself enjoy anything around him this week. Like, in a world that if one were to make me guess who would be the better fit, Sam would for sure find escapism in a roleplay fantasy world like this. However, continuing on with what we've seen of Sam this season, he really has his like one-track mind to just like finish the mission, closing the demon gates, and like sort of be done with hunting. So distractions like a bit of escapism are not something he feels he can indulge in right now.
I think I'm seeing this entirely differently, like from a completely different perspective, because I'm seeing it as him using work as an escape from being sad about Amelia. And we've seen Sam using work as an outlet before, many, many times, right? So this isn't new. And it's actually kind of an expected thing, I think, for Sam. I would also go a little bit further and say that LARPing is probably not Sam's idea of fun. So it would make a lot of sense that he wouldn't use it as a way to like escape his current circumstances, right? Sam and Dean cosplay a lot, all the time. Like as FBI agents mostly, but also as like other professionals like that we've seen in previous seasons. Like off the top of my head, I'm remembering like park rangers. I'm also remembering like security company reps from like earlier season. Dean is like kind of like, oh, well, you know, you used to be in theater. You should be loving this. And Dean is the one loving the costumes. And Sam is just not into it at all. And it's really the same thing when they're on set or like in prison. I think those are like in season 2 or 3. And Dean just loves the idea of cosplaying, whereas Sam is like, oh my God, just get me out of here, right? The dynamic that kind of shows up in this episode wasn't all that much of a surprise.
If you were to describe to me like the premise of this episode, my assumption would be is Sam's a little more understanding and Dean would be the one who's more like, ugh, the nerds. And the fact that like it's reversed and like really you're right is the more accurate depiction of the two of them, I think is such an interesting take on it, because I really would picture like if you told me one of them was secretly sneaking off to like go LARP with their friends and like, you know, when they were younger, I would have said it's Sam. So the fact that Dean is like more into it and Sam, you're right, equates it to the job. Like this is what they do every day, but more realistic because they're actually fighting real monsters, but they're playing these faux roles and like putting on this act for everyone else. I think that's such an interesting like nugget of information in this episode that it does. And I don't think it was necessarily intentional or unintentional. I think it's sort of just world building in a very fun way, but I really, really love it.
I feel like Sam would enjoy magic cards, but Dean loves LARPing. Does that make sense? Nerds, please tell me if this makes sense.
Such an accurate thing to say. Like between those two, like level, like both are nerdy. Like, I think it's those things where like anyone from the outside looking in goes, they're both nerd shit. What's the difference? And like myself being a nerd who's done both of these things in his life can say like, oh no, these are incredibly different like genres. Like
they attract different nerds, like entirely. Entirely. For having dated people from both areas, they attract very different nerds.
But there is a really cute moment with Sam when he's working out the symbol with the aid of a LARPer by the name of Galandria. She starts to flirt with Sam, thinking that they're still like in this game, and Sam even smiles back. He's happy. He had fun playing it and escaping a tiny bit. But after an invite for what is potentially more fun, he shuts it down. And not like the I'm not interested kind of way, but the like, nope, back to work, I can't have fun kind of way. Sam is not leaving himself any room outside of the job to be himself. And sure, he's got a lot going on in his head between this case and saving the world and, just getting over a breakup and having Amelia dragged back into his life recently. But everyone needs a little work-life balance, and we've seen Dean do this to himself, only to have Sam try to pull him out of it. And here we are in the reverse situation where Sam can't, take his head out of the work.
There's nothing wrong or weird about like refusing sex, right? Like Sam doesn't need to give a reason for saying no, and he also doesn't need to have a reason for saying no. Like no is enough, right? And like I'm also going to push back a little bit here because I do think that again, Sam's escape is the work. The thing that he's trying to escape from is his love life. So for somebody else that might work, but for somebody like Sam, I think that like jumping into bed with somebody new like seems kind of counterintuitive in terms of escapism. Like he's better off sticking with the work than to go have sex with someone and then think about Amelia.
It's when he does kind of like you almost see that switch flip in him where he has to go from like this was a fun interaction to I'm back to work, where it's like I feel like if Sam were declining sex from someone that he actually thought there was like something going on, but he's like, no, I'm in a bad headspace for this, versus the like, no, I'm shutting down the not work mode. It just, something about the way he dismisses it, which he has every right to do, and I think is the right choice to make in this situation, it just feels less like, no, I'm not ready for this, more of the, no, I'm back into work mode only, no, nothing else. And I think you're right, it's the escapism.
What is actually providing him with the escape that he needs is the work. So it's not like, oh, he's like a workaholic, like he can only think about work. It's that it's the only thing that actually makes him not miserable at the moment. Or at least that's how I'm picturing it. Of course, like maybe other people have different opinions.
No, I fully see it, and I think that's such an interesting, like, the fact that I didn't, like, see it initially, and I'm now kind of being shown it a bit more through you, which I thank you for. The idea that in an episode that is so clearly about escapism through the form of this recreational activity, that he can't let himself enjoy it because he's feeling his own escapism from his own issues through his work.
I think my whole point is that it's not that he's not letting himself, it's that it's not his preferred method of escaping, right? And I think that there is a very important difference because like if you offer me to go on a bender and like drink until let's say I'm heartbroken and you're like, you know what, we're gonna escape this and we're gonna go drink until you pass out, I'm gonna be like, listen, like I got work tomorrow, like, and it's not because like I'm in work mode and like I can only think about work. It's just because like to me that's not appealing, right? But if you're like, hey, you know what, like let's go to a spa, let's go have like some let's do something that you enjoy, then my attitude is going to be very, very different. And I sort of feel like this is what's happening with Sam. The activity at hand, which is LARPing, is just not appealing to him. The other activity at hand, work, is very appealing to him. And it's only a question of like a preferred method of coping.
I think that is just such a interesting dynamic to depict in an episode where we're seeing most other people's escape from the mundane work life in this LARPing, and Sam, who has no interest in it because the work is his escape. I think it's just an interesting dynamic to push through, and I'm glad you brought that to the table. As I said earlier, I would not have suspected Dean to enjoy the potential of LARPing as much as he seems to, and looking back, I think it's only because Dean would classify it as too nerdy for him. But like we know Dean is a big old nerd deep down. Like this is so him.
I don't even think it's that deep. Like he is just a big nerd. Like no deep down. Like scratch that. He is just a big nerd. Like that is it.
Very valid. We see little moments like his playing with the war miniatures on the map in Charlie's tent, that there's like a part of Dean that like longs for the escapism of playing a game like this, like would allow him to feel here in a world where his knowledge and strength would both be respected and admired without having to hide away from the people around him, like when he's hunting. Like he can be out and proud of who he is.
Just last week, we were talking about the different masks that Dean wears in his life, right? And it feels like cosplay, or LARPing in this case, kind of gives him an opportunity to maybe present aspects of himself under the guise of LARPing that he wouldn't otherwise really be showing. If I'm drawing from my own experience, like when I was stage acting in high school, I always felt really, really free on stage because I had the freedom to do things or to say things that I would otherwise never be saying in my life, right? And I kind of feel like Dean embraces this kind of escapism a lot more than Sam because Sam doesn't wear as many masks as Dean does. Like, Dean needs that kind of escapism, like, because of the shackles of his persona, if you want to put it that way, a lot more than Sam does. When we were watching, actually, somebody was like, one thing that's really interesting about this episode is like the freedom to be authentic through performance. And that has stayed on my mind like the whole time that I was thinking about this episode. And I'm like, that is so true. And like, anyway, this is not my field of study, but I know that there's a lot of literature written about performance, like in life and on stage, and like how we perform different parts of ourselves for different groups, et cetera, et cetera.
We see Dean admiring Charlie on her being comfortably out and proud. I feel like there may be some level of escapism he assumes with the freedom of LARPing being make believe, but I think he also sees how free she is and that it's not an act and she's genuinely open about her sexuality, game or no game. And he likes that. He wants that for himself too.
There's a lot of jokes in fandom about how like Charlie is Dean's emotional support lesbian, and like I cannot disagree with that. Like she immediately clocks that Dean is also going through a breakup, right? Like she's like, "Did you break up with someone too?" And not like a girl, someone, right? Me? No. 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 And like that's the moment actually in the episode where he is masking the most. Otherwise he's pretty much free with himself. Like his movements are even different, like the way that he acts when he's wearing that costume. Anyway, okay, so speaking of Dean's breakup, I do want to highlight this moment because Dean is talking about like Sam and Amelia, and he goes, but trust me, this life, you can't afford attachments, you just gotta let go. And that's when Charlie asks him, she's like, are you talking about Sam, or did you break up with someone too? And I find it so interesting that Dean is like projecting this onto Sam, right? Like he wants to escape having to talk about his own breakup, so he's focusing on Sam's. It's like, oh no, don't talk about me. Oh my God, but Sam is going through a breakup. And again, like, so relatable, my dude.
It's like almost unfair that like that cliche of like it's not for me but for a friend. If he were going through a breakup right now with a guy, what would you tell him to do? But he actually has the like, conveniently my brother's doing the thing I'm doing, so I could use him as a disguise.
Now I don't know how this ended up here, but this is one last piece from the long game that was supposed to be up there, but it's no longer there. I don't know why. So I will say it anyway, because I think it's cool. But this is the second episode of Supernatural with fairies, and they take a very, very different shape than in Clap Your Hands If You Believe.
Speaking of fairies, Charlie. That's a weird transition to make. I'm not calling her a fairy. I'm saying her and the fairy hook up, and it's the cutest thing. But she's the best girl, and she's back. And she's literally the queen of my people, as she rightfully should be. The escapism is so strong with her here, as she is literally using this as an escape from her last life that was upended by her encounter with the brothers and Leviathans. However, a bit on the nose, but not in a bad way. She is taking it very literally and not just escaping her past, but escaping reality as a whole via LARPing.
Even though Charlie is very free with like her sexual identity, she also wears masks, right? Like, although, like, and in a very completely different way from Dean, but like we knew from the last episode that we saw her that Charlie Bradbury wasn't her real name. So she was assuming a fake identity. And in this episode, she's assuming a new identity that she took up like after leaving Roman Enterprises. So that's like another mask right there. So maybe, just like Dean, this character that she's performing when she's LARPing is actually allowing her to show some really genuine parts of herself that she wouldn't be showing otherwise. Kind of like when she goes, well, I want to go, but the queen, she needs to stay. And so she's like tapping into a courage that like she wouldn't necessarily always be displaying through the performance of that character, the queen.
I feel like I've seen so many like shows or movies where like a character is playing someone in like a stage play and has to like embody the character so they can like show their true self, and it's like a weird, like not super blunt cliche, but like kind of a cliche, and it's so cute on her. I think this is the most apt time to see it in our theme this week, but there is escapism like those here who play along until the point of danger when, you know, shit gets real, like Dean pulling a gun. The spell's broken and folks understand that it is no longer a game. We see the extreme, however, in our villain this week, who only sees the game and thus goes too far, which shows Charlie that she can't just run away each time something goes wrong, and the real world does still exist around her and need to be faced.
On that level, I think that the episode takes like the modern idea of escapism and takes it to like its most like extreme and evil iteration with Boltar, right? The thing that I'm kind of getting from this idea is that there's a relationship between escapism and safety, or escape and safety, right? Like in what you're talking about here, people can only really LARP if they feel safe. Like the second some strange large dude starts shooting a gun with live ammo, like it's no longer safe and it's no longer an escape. And so like immediately gameplay ends.
And I think it's actually such a well portrayed theme this week because we really do get to see the overuse versus the balanced use from our players. And while I do not want to draw a parallel between Charlie and Boltar, I think Charlie does it herself and sees what getting in too deep and ignoring reality can do, obviously an extreme level. And I don't think this would ever happen to Charlie, but she sees what she needs to see to learn her lesson about escapism.
I do think that you're right there. Like Charlie and Boltar are both escaping too much, so to speak, like in their very, very different ways. Like for Boltar, the game is the escape from his life. And for Charlie, like her different identities are the escape from her life. And that was literally, she was confronted with the worst case scenario.
It's so often we see Sam or Dean having to face whatever the monster of the week is and dealing with something through that. That's what Charlie gets to do this week with Boltar. Do we ever get a non-character name for him?
Yes, Jerry.
You know what? I tried to look for it and I couldn't find it. And the fact that I couldn't find it made it like so interesting that they what if they never gave him one? I'm a little bummed they do. I kind of wish they never did. It would just make him more like
it's twice actually in the episode. Once at the beginning when like he's putting the the teeth back in the orc after like they've fallen down. And he's like, "Thanks, Jerry."
I think there would be something kind of interesting about having a character who's so in universe that he doesn't even reveal his real name at any point, and his real name is his chosen name. I think there'd be something there, but again, I think I was overreaching for something because I couldn't find an answer.
So when we watched this episode with our patrons, I hadn't watched Merlin yet. Like, not a single episode. I'd seen screen caps, but like apart from Merlin and Arthur, I really had no idea of who was who, right? Like I would see screen caps of people, but I wouldn't have been able to point out like this is Guinevere, this is, you know, like I obviously knew the names of the characters because they're part of the Arthurian legends, but I just didn't know who was playing who. But I was also slowly going through Still His Kingdom Keeps, which is Chris and Jeremy's Merlin podcast. And it was kind of like a way to keep me company on my runs, just like a fun thing to listen to, like without having watched the show, because it meant that I could also just imagine whatever was going on. And so like I was particularly disappointed to find out that Morgana doesn't actually have a zine, even though like I was promised that she had a zine in their show. But anyway, whatever. Just gonna register a complaint later. It was kind of almost like reading a book in that way, right? Like just being able to imagine everything. We're watching this episode, and at one point I go like, you know, this is really how I picture the set of Merlin. Like when I picture Camelot, it kind of looks like Moondor, and the costumes are kind of the same. And people in the chat were like, well, you're not wrong. Flash forward. So I've watched seasons 1 through 4 of Merlin, and like I was right. if you look at a lot of the stuff that happens in this episode, like Charlie's army's primary color is red, just like in Camelot, right? And one thing that I noticed when I was rewatching this episode is that Dean's costume is like very similar to Arthur's. And you know what? Like, it's not actually impossible that they took some inspiration from Merlin, because this episode aired in 2013 and Merlin started airing in 2008. So it was like a well-established show by then, and it had like an important fan base on Tumblr. Like, that's personally where I saw the screen caps that I saw. And if you remember, like if you were like super Hulock adjacent, you had to have seen some posts about Merlin, even if you weren't actually watching the show. And I just think that it's really neat that we can see so many like contemporary media references in Supernatural. I feel like we've talked about this a lot this season, but they just keep showing up like in much more meaningful ways than they have before. So maybe that's a theme to look at for this season. This week we have a message from Ruby. This is actually the last one from Ruby, so if you'd like to send us some more, Ruby, we would be very, very happy. And before we listen to it, we want to remind you to send us a 3-minute voicemail to respond to anything we discussed today, or to ask us a question. You can use the recording app on your phone and email us the recording at carryingwayward@gmail.com.
Hey, this is Ruby again. So I was listening to your episode on the Hooked Man, and I believe it was Dave brought up tarot cards, specifically the fact that the first victim, the boyfriend, is hung up like that in a way that is reminiscent of the tarot card of the Hanged Man. And I do tarot a lot, and the Hanged Man is one of those cards that I find very interesting. And you brought up a lot of what that card means, specifically being stuck in a place, being uncomfortable, being perhaps in pain or miserable with your life as it is. But one thing that you didn't bring up that I always keep in mind with that card is the fact that if you look at the illustration of it, you can kind of see this mostly in the Rider White illustrations, the classic illustrations of the tarot cards, is that the person on the card isn't hung up by someone else. They're hung up in that specific way because they put themselves in that situation. Which is not to say that the situation is any less miserable or uncomfortable, but more it's kind of bringing to mind imagery and details from the story of Odin and the summer tree, which in that story, Odin gets himself hung from the summer tree and gives up one of his eyes for knowledge. He puts himself in an uncomfortable, painful situation in order to gain something. And I felt like that was a really interesting and potentially important thing to include with the theme of that episode and the stuff that's happening in that episode, particularly in the way it pertains to Sammy, and also the main girl, who I can't remember her name right now, and I can't look it up because I'm driving, but they put themselves in a situation of being uncomfortable, of being potentially miserable for a little bit, in order to experience something they've never had in their life up to that point, to experience a bigger world, to gain knowledge beyond their little sphere of influence that they grew up with. Sammy with being raised by John to be a hunter and a warrior, and the main girl with her upbringing in the church by her father. And so it's very interesting to look at it in that light, because it's not just you're in this situation and you're miserable and you're uncomfortable. It's you're in this situation and you're miserable and uncomfortable, but you will gain something out of this. You will come out of this smarter, and you might feel like you're stuck, but you're not. You put yourself in this position. You have the power, and you can get yourself out of it. You just have to address the fact that you are where you are because of where you came from. Often when in a tarot reading, when you get that card, it's in relation to the past or the present, and kind of signifies that you're looking at what is happening in a glass half empty sort of way. And the reason that is because you are not addressing pain and misery that came in the past, and you're kind of wallowing in it. And once you address it and can heal from it and learn how to live with it and move past it, you can get yourself out of this tree and you can move forward. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting that you brought up that specific tarot card and that specific imagery, because I do think it's one of them that is really, really relevant to the episode. And hopefully this adds a little bit of more information. So yeah, bye.
Ruby, thank you for that message. I will be honest. There was like a good moment where I saw the title of the voicemail and I was like, oh, right, we did talk about the Hanged Man card during Hookman. And then not in a million years did I think this conversation that you were leading us on would end or result in Odin and losing his eye. But, like, again, one, love deep lore, but anything in this category of, like, the occult and mythology and tarot and other cultures, so thank you for all of that. But also, like, you're right, it's an incredibly apt theme of this, like, putting yourself in a situation and then having to address the things about you, which is, I was gonna then say, like, yeah, like, I can't remember the episode that well. That was season 1. Holy wow, that's been a while. But it was season 1, right? It wasn't? Yeah, season 1 for sure.
It was like one of the first episodes, actually.
And then I thought, like, oh, but it's also very potent to this episode. The idea of, like, Sam and Dean are both dealing with these breakups, and even Charlie dealing with the having to find a new life. And they just need to address the thing that is affecting them and find out how to move past it and heal. And then it occurred to me, that is the entirety of this damn show. Is people not addressing the things they need to address and learning and growing and healing. So I love the journey, this one little thing that was brought up. I think also, did we bring up the Hangman card, or was it a voicemail that week?
No, you did. You brought it up.
I brought it up. Wow. Good for me.
Good for you.
I smart. But Ruby, thank you. Thank you for taking some comment I made and some observation I made and expounding on it tenfold in awesomeness through that episode, this episode, and 8 seasons of the show so far.
Yeah, Ruby, thank you so much for sending this to us. You know, it's kind of interesting because, like, this idea of, like, discomfort for, like, this discomfort being self-inflicted is, like, a really interesting one to me, because, like, discomfort isn't always a bad thing, right? Like, in this episode anyway, we've talked about a lot of characters, like, doing anything they can in order to escape any kind of discomfort. In and of itself, discomfort is not necessarily a bad, like capital B thing, right? Like you said, bringing back this idea of Odin, like giving up his eye for knowledge, like sometimes, you know, not to sound like a gym bro, but no pain, no gain kind of thing, right? And I'm just kind of thinking about this idea of discomfort for gain or for growth. And what that reminds me of is self-discipline. And I'm kind of wondering also what that means for, well, I mean, if we're talking about Sam, like this is what we're seeing in this episode, right? Like his self-discipline is to be like, you know, this kind of escape with Galandria sounds really good, but I know it's not actually the best for me. And I need to like sit in whatever it is that I'm not feeling good about. I think there's kind of different ways of looking at this. But thank you so much for making my brain bubble up like this. I appreciate that. What's your reflection and call to action this week?
I mean, is it any more clear how much I use escapism as my way of handling difficult things? I'm a textbook example of finding a good game or a show and just falling into it for a night or nights to help get my mind off anything that might be troubling me. And this week's episode hit close to home, as I've never gotten in that far as either of Boltar or Charlie did. And, you know, it's never been that bad in a long time, at least. It's just very Charlie-esque reminder that I cannot just jump headfirst into the game of the week and let the world move on around me, but I kind of do have to, like our voicemail said, see the things I'm in and figure out how to move past them and actually heal. And you, Mary?
Well, one thing that I really love about this episode is the play aspect of it, and we didn't really talk about that, but this idea of like putting on clothes that aren't yours and like acting like a different person can just be so freeing. So I feel called to play a little bit more, to like step outside my comfort zone when it comes to like performing myself, I guess. This was Carrying Wayward, a supernatural podcast produced by Rochelle Castellano, hosted by Drew Schulman and Marie Vigourou. Thank you to everyone supporting us on Ko-fi or Patreon, especially our bunker supporters, Elle, Jeremiah Thomas, and Simone. We'd also like to thank Jacqueline Hart for our music and Jacqueline Tucci for additional sound editing. Head over to carryingwayward.com to become a patron or a Ko-fi subscriber and for our merch store and our socials. And write us a review on Apple Podcasts. Carry on, our wayward friends.